When I was a small child, a few days a week, my grandmother would pick my siblings and I up from school. We spent many nights with her, especially during the summer months. This particular summer was a very spooky time in my life. I hadn't had much experience with the supernatural before or since this time. My grandmother lived in an old rundown house on Cotton Gin Road. She had no running water, so we usually had to go fetch buckets of water from a nearby branch. It had an outhouse in the back and also a large forest. To my shock, there was an old graveyard within this forest. My siblings and my cousins and I often played in these woods. We climbed trees and walked down the many paths that encompassed the land. I remember being so fascinated with her wood cook stove and would help light fires for the wood we gathered. For a while, this place was great. But then, one day, I was playing in the woods by myself. From out of nowhere, a voice called my name. My name is Jamie, so it wasn't hard to miss, especially when it kept being repeated. As I glanced ahead of me, a ghost-like figure appeared from some distant trees. It was a ghost of a woman. She held out her arms and kept calling my name and asked me to come closer. At this age, I had seen a good few horror movies, and I didn't think it would be a good idea to approach this apparition. Instead, I took off like a bolt of lightning. I didn't stop running until I came to the steps of the front door. Once I opened the door, I was usually greeted by my grandmother's two Pekingese puppies, Angel and Husky. These two puppies made me feel so safe, and I played with them, and I soon pushed the ghost image out of my mind. At night, all the kids slept in the bed that was in the living room of the small house. After we all had our giggles and laughs and grandmother was in her bed, we would settle down and try to sleep. But most nights, there would be little to no sleep. It usually would start with soft, slow footsteps near our bed. Sometimes my siblings and I would open our eyes and look at each other in fear as the steps would get closer and closer to the bed. We knew it wasn't the dogs because they were sound asleep in their little corner of the room and hadn't moved an inch since bedtime. We would ease the covers over our heads and just lie there in fear. Once the steps were right in front of the bed, heavy breathing could be heard. Then the breathing would stop. Maybe 10 minutes later, we would hear something thumbing through the calendar that hung from the wall above the bed we slept on. This occurrence would start and stop all through the night. From that time on, I would have nightmares about the ghost calling my name as she chased me everywhere. Her face would turn into this hideous creature and try to gobble me up. Just as I saw her large teeth, I would wake up moaning and fighting. Regardless of these unusual events, us kids knew better than to tell the adults, for fear of being laughed at and told it was just our imaginations. Outside of those occurrences, everything seemed normal. I just made sure to never go into the woods alone. Things started to come to a head, though, one night when we were in bed, and during all the spooky commotion, we heard a voice say, "You need to get out of this place." This terrified me to the point of total paralysis. I could not move or say anything for a few hours until my tired mind drifted to sleep. The next morning I tried my best to forget what had occurred that night, but the memory would creep into my mind throughout the day. Later that day, my grandmother loaded all of us kids into the car and took us to town grocery shopping. On our way back, about a mile from my grandmother's house, a tree suddenly fell into the road ahead of us. After my grandmother pulled over to the side of the road, we all jumped out and were able to move the tree from the road. My mind couldn't help but wonder if there was some kind of spooky connection between the ghost and this fallen tree. It sent goosebumps down my spine to think that if the car had been any closer to that spot, we would have been smashed. Once we were all back in the car, Grandmother headed towards her house. Just before Grandmother turned into the driveway, we noticed heavy smoke. As she pulled into the driveway, we saw that her house was fully engulfed in flames. Her front door was wide open, but her dogs were nowhere to be seen. My grandmother called out to her dogs as she fell to the ground on her knees and began to sob. She just knew her dogs were dead. Some nearby neighbors came over to check on us and went and called our parents as Grandmother had requested. It wasn't long before the fire trucks, police, and our parents showed up. All any of us could do was watch as the house and everything in it burned to the ground. All my grandmother could do was cry for hours over the loss of her home and dogs. The next day we found out that the dogs weren't actually dead. In fact, they were sort of heroes. It turns out they actually followed the man who had robbed my grandmother's house and then burned it to cover up his crime. When he left the front door open after dousing the place with gasoline and lighting a match, the dogs followed him as he ran down the road. He threw rocks at them and even hit them a few times, as they had a few bloody gashes from the rocks. But they continued to follow him. Once he heard sirens, he dashed into a hiding place behind some bushes. He kept shooing the dogs away. Finally, the dogs ran up to some police officers who were patrolling the area due to the fire. The officers spotted the dogs, but the dogs took off running back towards where they came from, and the officers followed them in the police car with a spotlight. The dogs led the cops right to where the burglar was hiding. The man was found with a bag of grandmother's stolen items, some matches, and a can of gasoline. Needless to say, he was convicted and went to jail. My grandmother was just happy to be reunited with her dogs. She moved in with us for a few months and then moved into a better house just down the road from us, so we could go visit her anytime we liked. But to this day, no matter how scary things seemed at the time, I wonder if those ghosts were just simply trying to warn us to stay away for our own good.